and we'll come back in here, and we'll have our luncheon speaker. Is going to be Ken Kramer on the 100th anniversary of the Conservation Amendment that's set all the conservation programs in action a little over 100 years ago. It was actually last year, but he gave an interesting talk, and I look forward to it, and I think you will too. So go ahead and mingle for a few minutes, and as soon as lunch is ready, we'll run you through.
Volunteer Water Resources Chair and retired Director of the Lone Star Chapter of the Sierra Club. He has been associated with the club in volunteer and professional capacity since 1978. He previously taught government and political science at various colleges in Texas, and Dr. Kramer is a member of the State Water Conservation Advisory Council and on the board of the Texas Water Foundation. He is also the editor of Living Waters of Texas, published by Texas A&M University Press in 2010. He's going to talk today about the 100th anniversary of the Conservation Amendment. This is where the citizens of the state of Texas amended the Texas Constitution for the state to address its resources, and today he's going to speak on that. Let's give Dr. Kramer a warm welcome.
And just hit there, that direction. Okay. Thanks. Thanks very much, Steve. I want to express my appreciation to C.E. Williams and all the staff of the Panhandle Groundwater Conservation District for this symposium and for inviting me. This is the first time I've had an opportunity to be here at the Panhandle Symposium, and I'm very impressed with the organization, with the speakers, and the diversity of the attendees. I think we're all here because we are concerned and interested in water and water conservation, and it's an important topic for all of us throughout Texas. I happen to have grown up in Houston, pretty familiar with some of the water issues there. I currently divide my time between Austin and my family property in Austin County, which is near Belleville and Brenham, which most of you probably don't know where that is, but you probably heard of Bluebell ice cream from Brenham. And it's about halfway roughly between Austin and Houston. And a few years ago, I inherited my family's property in Austin County, which was originally a cotton farm, and then a cow-calf operation for a number of years that my grandfather and then my father ran. And my wife and I are about to move there and become rural residents full-time next year. So I very much appreciate water in a number of senses, because now we're basically dependent upon a groundwater well. We're certainly looking at and probably will do rainwater harvesting for our new house that we're building. And all this really demonstrates, I think, how important, how diverse water is. And so one of the things that to me is very interesting is the role that the legislature and the Texas Constitution have played in how we deal with this diversity of water issues. And today, basically what I'm giving you is a history presentation, if you will, about the development, the background to the Conservation Amendment to the Texas Constitution, which was adopted in 1917, a little bit over 100 years ago. I'm glad I'm able to give a history presentation today because when I was an undergraduate in college, my major was history, and I think my dad never quite figured out of what value a history major was and why he should be paying good money for his son to go get a history major. Well, today, being a history major is of value. Finally, I can do a history presentation. All right, so as I said, the Conservation Amendment, which we'll discuss in a little bit of detail, was adopted over 100 years ago in 1917. And I was first made aware of the 100th anniversary of the Conservation Amendment adoption a couple of years ago by a young friend of mine, Thaler Smith, who's a University of Texas law student, now in his second year. And so I want to, if this advances, give thanks to Thaler because basically I'm stealing part of his presentation to do this today. He made a similar presentation at the Texas Groundwater Summit last August, which some of you may have attended, and was kind enough to share some of his slides with me that I've augmented for this presentation. The Conservation Amendment is very important to all of us interested in water, and I want to give you a little bit of a history of how this Conservation Amendment came about, and most of my presentation is going to focus on that, although we'll talk a little bit about what its relevance is today and what it portends for the future. An important part of the context of the Conservation Amendment is something that we've already talked about today, and that is pretty familiar to most of us here, and that is that Texas is a land of drought. Here you see a picture in 2011 of the Brazos River running dry through Knox County. And in 2011, at one point during, I think, the early fall, about 80% of the state of Texas was in the worst stage of drought, right before some rains came in and broke the drought for some parts of the state. But we all know that Texas is not just a land of drought, it's also, as Jeff Linder very dramatically described this morning, a land of floods as well. Here you see the Brazos River at a different point in the river closer to the Texas coast, overflowing its banks between Angleton and Rocheron in 2016, just 5 years after drought had impacted the whole area. I'm going to be talking, as I discuss the historical context of the Conservation Amendment, a lot about the Brazos River and the Brazos Valley. And I realize that the Brazos Valley is not part of this region of the Panhandle, but as many of you may know, the entire watershed of the Brazos actually reaches into the Panhandle in the Lubbock area and goes all the way to the Texas Gulf Coast. And the Brazos River and the history of the Brazos River played a big role in the creation of the Conservation Amendment, as we'll see as we go through this. So, droughts and floods in Texas have been a recurring cycle. Tree ring studies and other studies have indicated that Texas has experienced decade-long droughts at least once a century since the 1500s. So that's a very long record, if you will. But Texas has also experienced catastrophic floods, as Jeff Linder pointed out this morning. Case study of the Brazos River in the late 1800s. 1833, which was a few years before Texas independence fight, there was a great flood that hit the Brazos. This was, of course, in the days of the Stephen F. Austin colony and subsequent development and farms being created in the Brazos Valley. 1833 to 1842, however, after the floodwaters subsided, the Brazos Valley experienced an extended drought. But then in 1842, in the summer, rainstorms caused a major flood on the Brazos. And then from 1842 to about 1900, you had major floods periodically recurring on the Brazos, with increasing economic losses as the area became more developed, not only in terms of agriculture, but other economic development. And this continued into the early 1900s. To give you an example, 1913 brought major floods to Texas during the month of December. Guadalupe, Colorado, Trinity, and Brazos rivers all overflowed their banks at the same time, and they flooded approximately 3,000 square miles of Texas. Here's a picture that's representative of part of the problem. This is part of downtown Waco, Elm Street, on December 4th, 1913. The property damages from this particular flood were staggering, given the reach across 4 of the river basins, and the damage was estimated about $3.5 million, which in 1913 dollars was a significant amount. And at least 177 people lost their lives statewide as a result of this flooding. But again, following the floods in 1913 and then again in 1915, drought returned to Texas and the Brazos Valley, and it lasted until 1919. Now, this photo, admittedly, is not from that period. I couldn't find a photo from that period, but this is the Brazos River, and it's a picture of the Brazos in drought in 2009. And it represents the type of drought that was experienced in some parts of the Brazos during the latter part of the period 1915 to 1919. And by the way, for those of you who have heard about the historic drought of the 1950s, which is still the historic drought in terms of a multi-year period in Texas, this particular drought from sometime in 1915 through 1919 was considered the drought of record prior to the 1950s. So there were early attempts to try to deal with the problems in the Brazos Valley, especially in the Colorado and some other river basins, to try to control the flooding and to also try to store water, to have water available during drought situations. And so, for example, in the early 1900s, in 1902 to be specific, there was a meeting in Houston that was organized by a couple of gentlemen from the Brazos Valley, a man by the name of D.C. Giddings from Brenham. And if you know anything about that area of Texas, Giddings is another town close to Brenham that was named after him. And then a man named Leonard Tillotson Seeley, they got together to organize a group of business people and local leaders to form a Brazos River Improvement Association. And their intention was to create some type of civic organization that would push for actions that would lead to control of the flooding and provision of water supply in the Brazos Valley. Those two men, by the way, later were pivotal in the creation of what we now know as the Brazos River Authority. But the problem that they faced was that despite the concern and despite the attempts to take action, there was really no viable legal mechanism to do this. Local communities would drill wells for water. They would take water out of the Brazos or the tributaries for drinking water supply and other purposes, but they didn't really have the financial ability, or in some respects, the legal authority on a regional basis to actually undertake big projects that could control flooding by holding water back during major rainfall events, or that could provide a water supply on a large long-term basis. And so why was that? Well, part of the problem was the Texas Constitution of 1876. And for those of you that remember Texas history, this Constitution, which actually is the basic Constitution we live under today, although it's been amended several hundred times now, was created at the end of Reconstruction, after the end of the Civil War. And there was great backlash against the Reconstruction governments in Texas that to many people had basically restricted their abilities to take action and had been very dictatorial in how the governments were operated. And so at the end of Reconstruction, when some of the former Confederates were given back their voting rights, the people who took charge wanted to be sure that the Constitution, the new Constitution that they developed for the state, was going to be very restrictive of what state government, and for that matter, to some extent, local governments could do. And so they created a Constitution that gave very limited powers to the government. And that meant that if you needed to make any changes to try to undertake some big initiatives, you pretty much had to amend the Texas Constitution specifically to allow those particular activities. All right, and so that was one of the things that some of the Texans in the early 1900s tried to do. There actually was a constitutional amendment adopted in 1904 that authorized counties, cities, and certain local districts that might be created to incur debt in order to finance projects for flood control, navigation, or irrigation. But the problem was, again, under the concept of limited government, that they set a very high bar for creation of any districts to undertake these projects. And so a district would have to be approved by 2/3 of the property taxpayers resident in the county, or excuse me, in the district, who voted on whether or not to create a district. That was a very restrictive high bar, and not very much happened as a result of that. And even if you were able to create a district, or as a city or county wanted to pursue a project that required incurring debt, there were many restrictions on the amount of debt that you could incur, and they were so limited that in effect, it made only small local projects really realistic under this amendment. So 1904 amendment did not take care of the problem. Now, there was the possibility that the federal government could do certain things that might undertake projects on the rivers like the Brazos, but you may recall that at that time, it was primarily, of course, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that had the authority to undertake any major types of water projects, and they really, under their authorization statutes, could only undertake navigation projects. And you could try to redefine something as navigation, and certainly on the Brazos River, many people thought that you could, on a long-term basis, do navigation on the Brazos, but the Army Corps of Engineers could not do flood control projects or water supply projects at that time. I think it wasn't until the New Deal in the 1930s that they got that authority. So this is an example of what the feds, through the Corps of Engineers, tried to do in terms of a navigation project in March 1913 on the Brazos. And remember, there was a great flood on the Brazos in December 1913. I think it pretty much wiped out this project. So the proposed solution to this dilemma, that the amendment to the Constitution that had been tried did not really work, was not effective, and the feds couldn't really help, was to amend the Constitution again. And there seemed to be a lot of enthusiasm and interest, again in the Brazos Valley, but also in the Colorado region, to undertake a new state constitutional amendment. And so that's what essentially was done. In 1917, you have the Conservation Amendment, as we call it today. It's actually Article 16, Section 59 of the Texas Constitution. It has 3 sections. I've given you a little bit of the first section here, and I just want to emphasize that the conservation and development of all the natural resources of this state, and the preservation and conservation of all such natural resources of the state, or each and all hereby declare public rights and duties, and the legislature shall pass all such laws may be appropriate thereto. Now, I want to emphasize that this wasn't just an authorization to the legislature to undertake pass statutes for this conservation purpose. It was actually a pretty broad mandate to the legislature that they had a public right and duty to do these things, not just that they had the authority to do these things. And perhaps equally important in some ways was that there were two other sections of the Conservation Amendment. In Section B, authorized the creation of conservation and reclamation districts. And Section C authorized those districts to incur indebtedness for various projects. And the limitations under the 1917 amendment were much less restrictive than had been the 1904 amendment. So this allowed districts basically to have a realistic ability to incur debt if they were created and were intended for these purposes. Now, the primary legislative author of the 1917 Conservation Amendment was none other than Leonard Tillotson from Sealy, who had helped to form the Brazos River Improvement Association in 1902. By the way, I should say parenthetically, after the first meeting of the Brazos River Improvement Association, I don't think it actually ever met again. We can't find any records that it met again because they ran into these obstacles that eventually led to the 1917 amendment. But Tillotson was the primary author of the amendment, and by that time, by 1917, he had actually been elected to the Texas House of Representatives for more than one term. And so he sponsored the Conservation Amendment in the legislature, in the House, as a proposed amendment. It was co-sponsored, or excuse me, sponsored in the Senate by A.R. McCollum of Waco. And one of the reasons I emphasize their locations is that keep in mind that both Waco and Sealy, which is in Austin County, where my property is, are both in the Brazos Valley. So they're in the Brazos River region. And again, even though there were other co-sponsors of the legislation in the Senate and the House, emphasizes the fact that this was very much an initiative of people in the Brazos Valley, although the Conservation Amendment, of course, has statewide implications. The proposed amendment was unanimously approved in the Senate and passed the House with only 4 dissenting votes. But then, of course, it had to go to the voters. As you know, constitutional amendments in Texas have to be approved by the voters. And it was set for a vote by the people of Texas on August 21st, 1917. It was the only item on the ballot. This is how important the sponsors of the legislation proposed amendment thought it was, that they made it the only thing on the ballot that day that was up for a vote. And so all the major newspapers in the state editorialized in support of the proposed amendment, urged people to vote for it. You probably can't see it very well, but in the upper right-hand corner of the front page of the Houston Post for August 21st, 1917, was a plea to vote for the amendment, and they had editorialized for the amendment prior to that time. But those of you who know your history remember 1917, we were in the midst of World War I. And for those of you that know Texas history, you may recall that in 1917, Texas was experiencing a little bit of a political crisis in that the governor at the time, James Ferguson, also known as Pa Ferguson, was being impeached for corruption. And so there was a little bit of voter distraction around August 21st, 1917 by World War I and the fact that the governor was headed for impeachment. And perhaps as a result of that, the voter turnout for this one amendment on August 21st was pretty pathetic. Of course, we continue that tradition with constitutional amendments in Texas today of having pretty pathetic voter turnouts. But at that particular date, only about 86,000 voters statewide cast a ballot. And there were many comments about how pathetic the outcome, or not the outcome, but the turnout was. But nevertheless, the amendment was approved by a comfortable margin of about 57% to 43%. And so there was a victory there. But it wasn't automatic in terms of follow-up. Because they were in the midst of World War I, and there were a lot of problems in trying to incur debt at that point for many reasons. Any large-scale projects to try to do flood control or water supply were actually delayed by World War I and other obstacles. And the first large-scale new conservation reclamation district was not created until 1929, and that was the Brazos River District, which we now know today as the Brazos River Authority. It was renamed in 1953. And guess who the first general manager of the Brazos River Conservation Reclamation District was? No, none other than Leonard Tillotson, the guy who had authored the amendment in the House of Representatives. And I guess by that time, Mr. Tillotson needed a job because the Depression had hit, and his bank in Sealy had basically cratered. So he was looking for some gainful employment. And he was obviously very dedicated, and so I'm not trying to make light of that. But he was hired as the new general manager in 1930 of the district, but unfortunately died a year later. And so he never got to see any of these major projects come to fruition on the Brazos River. It really wasn't until later in the 1930s, in part through the federal government and funding, that you had the first major project on the Brazos. But although it wasn't initially perhaps an amendment that had a great deal of impact, the Conservation Amendment over the years has been very broadly interpreted by the courts and by the legislature, so that it has had quite an impact on Texas. Initially, I think Tillotson conceived of the amendment, even though he thought it provided a broad mandate to conserve resources and utilize them efficiently. He thought of it primarily in terms of water and forest. But actually, the courts and the legislature have come to interpret the amendment to include other natural resources, most prominently oil and gas. And so all the regulations we have under the Railroad Commission to conserve oil and gas resources stem from the constitutional authority of the Conservation Amendment. And the Conservation Amendment was initially, I think, spurred by concern about controlling, developing, and conserving surface water, but it was also applied over the years to groundwater, and it's actually the constitutional underpinning for the groundwater conservation districts that we have today in Texas. So it's an extremely important part of the Texas Constitution to all of us who are concerned about water and other natural resources, and especially to those who work in groundwater management as well as surface water management. So basically, the reason I'm trying to impress upon you the importance of this amendment is that it was something that originated from certain conditions on some of the river basins of the state and the continuing cycle of drought and flood, but it is something that's come to have a much broader meaning statewide over the years, and it still is the basic constitutional authority and directive to the state legislature and to entities of the state to conserve and preserve and utilize the natural resources of the state. So I think we owe a debt of gratitude to people like Leonard Tillotson and others in the early 1900s who saw the need to establish this constitutional basis for natural resources management in Texas. And as I see it, our responsibility today, be we working for a conservation district, managing groundwater, working at the state level, Texas Water Development Board, being an environmental advocate, being an agricultural producer, a leader in business and commerce. Our responsibility today in this century is to have the foresight that allows future generations to take action to protect our natural resources and use them wisely. And it's true that not everything that the sponsors of the amendment in 1917 wanted the amendment to do actually accomplished all those things immediately. And it's true that we still have major challenges, especially in water management and in dealing with droughts and floods, as we heard earlier from Jeff Linder. These days, we still have a responsibility to have as much foresight as possible to take the actions now that will allow future generations of Texans to enjoy the natural resources that we've had the benefit of. So thank you for the opportunity to bring that message to you, and I hope you've learned something from this history lesson I've finally been able to teach after almost 50 years since I graduated from college. Thank you very much.